Gerald Pounds. I don't know. Miss Connie put him on there. I think he had knee replacement or some kind of surgery like that, I think. All right, any others?
Do we have Daryl Ross up there?
Mm-mm.
What's wrong with Daryl? Daryl was still in with cancer. And then because we couldn't, we see how we do. No. It's just, I can't remember, somebody come up or something. But it's McNabb. Mr. McNabb.
There you go.
Oh, Jimmy. Okay, Larry Glenn McNabb's brother, but Jimmy. Okay. So it's.
Yeah, you know that one.
The Pittman side,
Yeah.
you're kin to him. Down the road.
I'm kin to a lot of people I don't know.
That family tree goes down the branch.
The Pittmans just kind of go and go and go. So yeah, I don't know.
I'm not going to say what I wasn't saying.
Yeah, that's, yeah. All right. Any others? All right. If not, let's have a word of prayer real quick. Brother Ivan, will you open us tonight?
Father, we just thank you for this day. Thank you for the beautiful day you gave us. Thank you, Lord, for your blessings and your goodness and your mercy. Lord, we just ask you to just be in our midst tonight. Help us to glean from this what you have us to. Help us to learn and put it in our hearts. Lord, help us to share it with others. And Lord, we ask you just to continue to watch over us and lead us and guide us. Bless our church. And Lord, help us to go out and proclaim your name. Lord, just bless this class tonight.
All righty. So tonight we are beginning round 2 of your Sunday WWE fight, I guess is what it's going to feel like. If you're with me on Sunday mornings, you got Romans and Paul shaking his finger, and then at night you're going to have James shaking his finger. So it's good. It's good stuff. What I'm going to hand to you is an outline of James. We'll talk about it in a minute, but outlining James is kind of a difficult task in a lot of ways because James is sort of, I don't want to say he's a hodgepodge, but he really likes to put a lot of stuff together without necessarily a logical sequence to it. So we'll see that kind of as we go through James. I will tell you that this is going to take us some time. Just because of the nature of James and the fact that he's dealing with a bunch of individual issues and sort of quick, punchy statements. And I don't use punchy to be funny. They are kind of punchy. If you've never done a study of the book of James, I would say be prepared to have your lifestyle challenged. Be prepared to have your lifestyle challenged, not just in terms of what you do day to day, but be prepared to have your assumptions about what it means to be a Christian challenged. The book of James is one of the more controversial books of the New Testament, or not those truths and those claims are borne out in the life of the Christian. Okay, so it's not easy. It's short. It's only 5 chapters, but it probably is one of the more difficult books in the Bible because of all of that. You'll see that the tagline I've chosen for it is faith that lives. You can see other pastors' takes on it, faith that works. They may, take that little phrase, faith without works is dead, and use that as their tagline. But I think as we think about James and the message of James, it is about a lived faith, not just a worked out faith, but one that is actually something that we get up in the morning and we base our lives on. Okay, and we don't necessarily always do that. That's not me coming after anybody. It's just who we are as people.
I don't remember where I was reading or what I was doing, but in 10 of 08, we did this at the Song Rehab when I was doing it. And I wrote in the top of my letter of James there, James wanted to confront members of the church with the responsibilities of the Christian life, and he wanted people to understand their ethical and moral involvement in the Christian community.
There you go.
And that was what I summed up.
Yep, and that's pretty much it. You heard it here first. Or second, I guess, because that was a note. But but it really is. I mean, and I like the use of the word ethical there, because I don't think we always think about Christianity in terms of ethics. We kind of want to leave that to business ethics or, HIPAA kind of healthcare ethics stuff, whatever. We're not out here thinking about what is the Christian code of ethics. But that's what James is giving us in a lot of cases. So I will say this to you. I tell some of my coworkers at the school, I don't want to know anything, because the more that I know, the more that I'm responsible for. Same situation with the Bible. If you don't want to know, leave now, okay? Because once you've heard it, you're responsible for it, all right? But it's also for that reason that I think James is one of the most important books for the contemporary church. And that's not to say the other 65 aren't, but it really speaks to a lot of the things. But we also need to proceed prayerfully as we go through James. And that's important anytime we study the Bible, but I think especially with something that is probably going to be as personal as this. Now, I will say that normally I don't live stream discipleship unless somebody asks me to. And in the case of Miss Connie, she said, I don't want to miss James. So you are being live streamed, so don't say anything that will incriminate you. Or do, that could be fun. But all right, so with that in mind, let's start thinking a little bit about authorship right after I find my clicker. There it is. Okay, so where did the book come from, and what is it anyway? And of course, now my clicker doesn't want to work, so great. We can not do that either. No, come here. Ha-ha. Okay, there we go. Let's try again. There we go. Okay, so where did it come from? Let's leave it there for a minute. Where did it come from? The leading position of church history in terms of who wrote James is James, the brother of the Lord. Now, in the Bible, you have got 4 options for James, 4 well-known options at least. So saying that it is James, the brother of the Lord, doesn't come without some controversy, but that is the tradition. So in the book of Acts chapter 1, verse 13, you actually have 3 of the 4 Jameses of James and Andrew, Philip and Thomas, Bartholomew and Matthew, James the son of Alphaeus, and Simon the Zealot, and Judas the son of James. So you've got 4 options again. You've got James the son of Zebedee. So these are James and John, the sons of thunder, right? Could be one of them. There's a good argument to be made for this James because he was an apostle. So he would have walked with Jesus, he would have taught and done miracles and seen Jesus do miracles and all the rest of it. So you can make a good argument for James the son of Zebedee. Your second option is James the son of Alphaeus. Again, another apostle, good option. According to Mark chapter 15, verse 40, this is probably also James the younger or James the lesser. You got 2, you got to figure out how to distinguish them, so there it is. Third option in Acts would be James the father of Judas. The only problem there is, I'm sorry, that should say, yeah, that's right, okay. Anyway, the only problem there is who's actually mentioned as Judas, right, as the apostle. James is just his dad. We don't know anything beyond that, and the only reason that designation is given is to differentiate him from Judas Iscariot, right? So there are 2 Jameses among the apostles, and there are 2 Judases among the apostles. So if that wasn't confusing enough, and then somebody along the way who you could make a little bit of an argument for. However, James the son of Zebedee was martyred in AD 44. So it's highly unlikely that he lived long enough to write something like this. He could have. That would have been about 14 years after the crucifixion and the resurrection of Jesus. So it could be James the son of Zebedee, but probably not. But I'll give you the traditional option, James, the brother of the Lord. Now, why is James, the brother of the Lord, not mentioned in Acts chapter 1? Because Jesus' brothers did not believe in him during his ministry. Sort of controversial, but that's just the way of it. And so when you get to the crucifixion, for instance, and Jesus gives Mary to John, it is not because there are no more children, it is because he gives Mary to a believer, a fellow believer, and that would be John the beloved, the gospel writer and the letter writer and the revelator.
And also because Jesus was the oldest of the siblings, it
Right.
fell upon him to provide.
To take
for
care of her.
her.
But after the whole thing with Jesus happens, the crucifixion, the resurrection, ascension, James begins to get it, right? And we know from church history that he quickly gains a position of prominence in the church in Jerusalem. So I want you to hold on to that Jerusalem bit because it matters for how we read James. The other two options here, again, James, the father of Judas, he's given to us as a descriptor for Judas, not as a power player. And James, the son of Alphaeus, James the younger, James the lesser, doesn't have the street credibility, you might want to say, that James, the brother of the Lord, would have later on, right? So it kind of plays to James, the brother's favor, that he is the brother of Jesus and also has such a reputation as Bishop of Jerusalem. Now, we are basically left to speculation at the end of the day. I mean, all of this is speculation. It's an educated guess. That has caused its own problems because there is no concrete evidence tying the book to James, the brother of Jesus. There is a suggestion out there which says that this book was written by some other Christian who then took the name of James because it would give the book some credibility in the public sphere. If it looked like it came from James, the brother of the Lord, or one of the apostles, people would be more likely to listen to it. So that theory is out there. However, problem with that theory is we also have people who are out here claiming it's a forgery or claiming it's a fake. We don't have that with the book of James. There's none of that evidence. That doesn't mean it's not there somewhere and we haven't discovered it, but at least to this point, we don't have any evidence to suggest that it's ever been thought to be a forgery or a fake or a pseudograph. So let's think about why would James, the brother of the Lord, be a likely candidate beyond just being Jesus' brother? Well, the first is that he becomes Bishop of Jerusalem. He has some staying power. He has some authority. If you'll remember when Paul receives his commission from Jesus on the road to Damascus, he goes to Jerusalem to meet with Peter and James in Jerusalem because they are considered kind of the pillars of the church there. So he's got that kind of credibility. An interesting angle to take this from is James's popularity with a group of really, really rigid Jews called the Ebionites. The Ebionites were ascetics, meaning they basically did not own very much of anything, and they certainly did not partake of the luxuries of the world. And even though they were Jewish Christians, they were very dedicated to the Jewish part of that identity. So these Ebionites are and it's all about Jesus, and Jesus fulfilled the law, and therefore you don't need to be Jewish and all of that. We don't like it. We don't agree with it. We think it's wrong. And they really, really, really like James because James says, you've got to live a certain way, and not only you've got to live that way, but here are the reasons why. And he uses the language of the Old Testament, and he uses the Old Testament law to back that up. Not least of all, he's also in Jerusalem, around the Jews, right? So, as we think about James had a unique mission field because he is in the capital of Judaism. They had some names for him, James the righteous and James the just, because he was so dedicated to faithfulness to the law and to prayer. But his faithfulness to prayer also got him the nickname Old Camel Knees. because he spent so much time praying that the sort of story goes that his knees became really thick and calloused and bony and gross, looking like a camel's knees. And as an old guy, he's walking around with these, big old knees. And I mean, we have evidence of that name being given to him. So, putting all of that together, it makes an awful lot of sense that James, the brother of the Lord, would be the one to write something like this. And as we come, at the end, when we get done with it, we can kind of circle back to this issue and point out some specifics. But, when you've got a group like the Ebionites that are saying that James is the true heir to Jesus' teaching because he gets the law part right, and he is Bishop of Jerusalem, and he is so dedicated to prayer and whatever else, I mean, again, personality-wise, it makes sense. But now the question for me, as I was reading all of this and researching it and whatever, is why was James so dedicated to the law? I mean, you can read the book. He is. That language is there. Why is he so dedicated to the law to the point that the Ebionites are going to put him over Paul? And the answer I came up with is probably pretty surprising, but he's in Jerusalem. He needs to talk the talk that people understand, that people know that they can resonate with. And Jesus doesn't abolish the law. Jesus says, I came to fulfill the law. So the language of the law is still in play. He can still do that. He can still speak that way and preach that way because it's a part of the culture. And it's not a part of the culture that Jesus said stay away from. It's just a part that he says has been fulfilled through me. So he would have prioritized, because of his audience, a continuity between Orthodox Judaism and Christianity. He would have wanted them to see that Jesus is the Messiah, and what he has brought and the message that he has brought is a continuation of what God was already doing through Israel and through the law. So that would have figured into his preaching and his teaching. So we shouldn't be surprised that his book has got this preoccupation with righteous living, and he puts it in terms of the law. There's enough of that stuff in James that some people sort of look at James and say, okay, this letter is kind of a mashup of Old Testament prophets and Old Testament wisdom literature. It's like if you take, I don't know, maybe somebody like Amos, be one of the minor prophets, but take somebody like that and Proverbs or Ecclesiastes and push them together, you would get something like James. But one thing that he does that is really unique is he sprinkles Jesus in without ever calling his name. If you know your New Testament and you know your gospel and you know the sayings of Jesus and the teachings of Jesus, as you're reading James, you can hear the resonances from the other stuff. But he's not quoting Jesus. He's not saying, as the Christ said. He's not saying, according to Jesus, the Son of God or the Son of Man. He's not doing any of that. It's just sprinkled in there, almost like a garnish. Like, here's what the law says. Here's how you should live. Oh, and by the way, here's some of that too. So how do you do that? You have to really know somebody to be able to do that. Right? You have to know what they would say in certain situations. You have to know what their beliefs are in certain situations. And who's going to know that better than somebody in the family? I mean, we could use the example of getting in trouble as children. We know exactly how Mama's going to react. We know what she's going to say. We know how Daddy's going to react. We know what he's going to say because we know them that well. Well, even though James didn't believe in Jesus when Jesus was doing his ministry, he still would have known how Jesus would have responded to what he saw and what he experienced. So, all right, we've got 4 primary features here. Features that help us to understand what James is actually writing. Most of our Bibles have in the title, the letter of James. That works about as well as anything, but we'll see. I think it's a little bit different than just a letter, because in one sense it is a literary letter. It's got the typical introduction of a letter. You could look at James 1 if you wanted to. James, a servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes in the dispersion, greetings. So you have a typical introduction in terms of a letter, but it lacks the other elements of a letter, right? Even Paul's letters have some personal reminiscences, right? Since I was last with you, I have heard reports, blah, 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 right? Or it's been told to me by Timothy or Titus, whoever. So you don't have any of that. It doesn't have any references to any particular people to whom he's writing. It really doesn't have any particular references to any specific problems or situations. And it doesn't actually have a proper closing to be considered a letter. So, okay, it's kind of a letter. It starts off like a letter, maybe we're a letter. So when I say diaspora letter, think about 1st and 2nd Peter. You get kind of the same thing there, right? Peter's writing this letter to the Jews who are of the diaspora, and he names all of the places where they are because he knows that they've been dispersed and they need some strengthening and some building up in their dispersion, so to speak. So that's kind of what James is doing more than anything else. But let's look at these 4 features, and then I'm going to tell you what I actually think he's doing. So the first thing you have is a strong tone of pastoral exhortation. Now, when I say pastoral exhortation, we may or may not really get this anymore. I think this used to be a feature of preaching that kind of has fallen out. James has more imperative commands than any other book in the New Testament. Now, you think about a book like Romans, or you think about a book like 1st and 2nd Corinthians, where Paul is really sticking it to who he's writing to. But in James, you've got more direct commands than you do in any other New Testament book. But those commands are given with a kind of pastoral care. And I say this has fallen out because now what we get a lot of times are suggestions out of what I call suggestions from the pulpit. I'm not saying that's what Kevin does. Nobody leave and say, well, Ian says he's not a good preacher. That is not what I'm saying. He's a great preacher. But by and large, church culture, we get an awful lot of, it might be good if you would try this in your life and see how the Lord blesses you. That ain't what James is doing, y'all. James is saying, you can do this. This is what's good for you. This is what you need to do. This is what you're commanded to do. I'm telling you to do it. In the back of his mind, the Lord commanded you to do it. Therefore, get with the program. But I love you. And I'm telling you this because I love you. And I'm telling you this because I care about your salvation. And I care about your walk. Second thing we've got is a certain looseness of structure. This is part of what gives people so many problems when they try to figure out what it is that James is doing. There are a lot of independent sayings and brief passages that are just kind of thrown into James. You'll be reading along and you'll hit a little section where there seems to be a stride, and then he'll just throw something totally different in there. And then when he comes back from that, he's gone a different direction. Why? Because, I'll come to the because. It's really hard to find a logical, sustained argument in the book of James. It's very loose. All right. Thirdly, he's a class act writer. There are lots of metaphors, lots of illustrations, the kinds of things we would expect from a good pastor. You tell me something, but then you give me an example of it, right? One of the things that we know even about how people learn is they're more likely to remember when you tell them a story than when you just tell them a bunch of facts, which is my downfall in here. But even there was the guy who was the dean of preaching at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky, Herschel York. I watched him do an interview one time, and somebody asked him what was the key to good preaching, and he said, good storytelling, because people will remember the stories more than the fact. But if you can weave the fact into the story, then it's gonna stick with them. Jesus and the parables, same idea. So James is not quite telling stories, but he's giving us all of these really good images. The billowing sea and the withered flower. I mean, when I say that, you can imagine it. The mirror, the horse, the ship, like we understand, these are all common. The patient farmer, they're common enough for us to connect with, but then what is he telling us through those images? And then the last feature is not quite as obvious to us, but his original readers and hearers probably would have caught it, And that is that he really, really likes to borrow from other sources. And again, if he were taking my English class, I would give him an F because he doesn't cite his sources. He's borderline plagiarizing some of the time. He just puts it in there. Sometimes it's word for word, sometimes it's paraphrased, but you can tell this is coming from somewhere else. People want to say that Hebrews is the most Old Testament book of the New Testament, and that's fine. But if you want to know what a Jewish rabbi would have sounded like, go read James. That's what he's occupying, is that kind of rabbinic perspective. To this point, here number 4, if you read James with some other early Jewish and Christian books, you'll find some striking parallels. So go read James and then read 1 Peter. There's a lot of similarity there in structure and style and tone and the rest of it. If you have a Bible that includes the Apocrypha, go read James and then read the Wisdom of Ben Sirach. A lot of commonality. If you have a pseudepigrapha at home, go read James and then read the Shepherd of Hermas. A lot of similarity. If you have, for some reason, the sermons of Clement, go read First Clement and then read James. A lot of similarity. Now, what is that saying to us? Not that James came first. I have no way to prove that. What it is saying is that James is operating from a widespread tradition of ethical teaching that Greek-speaking Jews would have known. Not just Jerusalem, Hebrew-speaking Jews, but Jews across the world. Notice this is written to the 12 tribes in the dispersion, so he's got to appeal to more than just the people in Jerusalem. But he's using this ethical tradition that goes beyond just all of that. Now we go back to the question. What is James? Is it a letter? Sort of. Some people say it's wisdom literature. So it's like Proverbs or Ecclesiastes, and it's got those short, really good, useful sayings. Some people have said it's a diatribe. We've talked about diatribes on Sunday mornings, this idea that you have an imaginary opponent, and so you're arguing back and forth with the imaginary opponent to try to set the record straight on how somebody should believe and act and whatever. He's not doing that. He doesn't have an imagined opponent. Some say it's paranesis. I have another list of these I should be going through. Paranesis, which is basically kind of like a quote book. Paranesis is just a bunch of stuff kind of put together that's vaguely connected through some semi-common point. It's not really that. I think it's a homily or a sermon. But I say homily because again, just a minute ago, if you wanted to know what a rabbi would have sounded like, go read James. And the rabbis taught through homilies. They're short, they're to the point, they're like one sort of application kind of thing. I mean, if you still want a good example of this, go to a massive Catholic church. They don't have 40-minute sermons, they've got 15-minute homilies. They've got a single point, they drive the point home, they get out of the way. Point. He sort of makes the point, goes to the next one. So in my mind, what he's doing is he's either summarizing what he teaches to his people at the Jerusalem church and sending it to them in the form of a letter, or he's taking his sermons and extracting key points out of those sermons and putting them together and sending them as a letter. But that's about the only way you can make sense of here's some of this and here's some of that and here's some of the other, and sort of the rabbit trails that James gets on. I like James because he chases rabbits like me. So that would explain some of that. If this is more like an anthology or a collection of key sayings from James's sermons, maybe. That also does open the possibility that James might not have directly been the writer. It could have been somebody within his congregation that put this stuff together, did produce it under James's name because it is James's stuff, but it's not directly from his hand necessarily. So you can still have that possibility if you want it. In any case, what his concern is that there are Jewish Christians who have been forced out for whatever reason, and they need the message that he has, and they need the teaching that he has. And he has to get it to them, and he can't do like Paul and go and preach all over creation. So his next best bet is to send a letter. So if you are familiar with the divisions of the New Testament, you will know that James comes in the section known as the Catholic epistles or the general epistles. It's a letter that's written to everybody. It doesn't have a particular audience, which is why he doesn't identify particular people other than the 12 tribes in the dispersion. There is a pretty good argument to be made that James was the first book of the New Testament to be written. So again, it would come pretty quickly after Jesus' ascension. Now, that doesn't mean what year, who knows. Paul's stuff is early too. We know Paul's stuff is early. We know Paul's writing by about AD 53. So for it to be the earliest, it would have to be before AD 53. So this is early stuff, and that may explain why there are some things missing. So let's think about that. The theological emphases of the letter. This is what makes the book controversial. Not that it seems to be cobbled together, not that we're sort of out to lunch on who exactly wrote it, but what does he choose to prioritize? Because it is very different than any other book in the New Testament other than Hebrews, because it's works. And good old Martin Luther, y'all remember some time ago when we did some church history stuff, Luther really, really, really did not like James at all. The reason for that is because Luther, what transformed Luther's life was the earth-shattering realization of Paul's doctrine of justification by faith alone. The idea that what saves you is simple belief, not anything else. You're not working to get there. You're not anything else. And the Catholic Church, during the time leading up to the Reformation, had said, you know what? Yes, you must believe and do X, Y, Z. And that's what will save you. So when Luther hit Paul and Romans and justification by faith, he thought, that's it. End of story. That is the central doctrine of the Bible, and anything that deviates from that is a problem and is not biblical. Well, then he hits James. James does not mention justification by faith alone at all. When you're Luther and you centralize justification by faith, he created problems for himself because there's no room for a message like James in that sort of thinking. So Luther said, this is a quote, I should have put it on the screen, but he says, quote, James mangles the scriptures and thereby opposes Paul and all scripture. So no love lost here. He also called James the epistle of straw.
Well, when Luther got old, what I read, he hated the Jews.
No, he did. He became very anti-Semitic. That was his personality. So what Luther did, and Luther translated the Bible into High German, which, by the way, Luther was brilliant. He created High German so that he could write a Bible or translate the Bible in German. He put James, Jude, Hebrews, and Revelation all at the end because they were secondary to him. Hebrews was too Old Testament, James was too works-oriented, Jude was too weird, and Revelation was incomprehensible. So what are we going to do? We'll stick them down there. Maybe you won't get that far. I mean, really. And you think about how people operate. He was probably right. The vast majority of people did not get that far. Luther said, I cannot include him among the chief books, though I would not prevent anyone from including or extolling him as he pleases. I like this. For there are otherwise many good sayings in him. So not good doctrine, just good sayings. Whatever. John Calvin, so the other side of the Reformation, John Calvin says that James seems more sparing in proclaiming the grace of Christ than it behooved an apostle to be. So notice that Calvin is not saying this is the brother of the Lord. He's saying that this is probably James of James and John. And then he noted, it is not surely required for all to handle the same arguments. So the way Calvin got around Luther's criticism was, well, they don't all have to say the same thing. And we do have a lot of the gospel stuff, so maybe it's okay. Everybody is going to pick a favorite book of the New Testament. Am I Jewish? No. But I do love it because it's, well, I think part of it's because we don't know who wrote it, and I'm still rooting for Priscilla over here. But who knows? Tradition says Paul, but Paul's Greek wasn't that good. Luther had a hard time with the works stuff, so it wasn't appealing to him. Calvin had a hard time with the works stuff, so it wasn't appealing to him. Now, on the other hand, the Roman Catholic Church really likes James. And some of it is a misreading of James, and some of it is we ought to do better as Protestants. Sorry. So, putting all of that aside, and maybe in defense of Luther a little bit, James is silent on what we consider to be most of the central doctrines of Christianity. There is nothing on the ministry of the Holy Spirit, not a word. There is nothing about the church, the theological significance of the church. It's not there. There is nothing about the fulfillment of the Old Testament in Christ. Not there. There's nothing about the death of Christ. There's nothing about the atonement. There's nothing about the resurrection. There's nothing about the birth. There's nothing about the miracles of Jesus. There is none of that. There are 2 references to Christ in the whole book, and there's only 1 reference in chapter 2 where he's actually described as the object of our belief. So why do we have this? I mean, that becomes one of the questions. Why do we have it? Well, I think for the reason that James wrote it. He's writing to people who were already well acquainted with the fundamental Christian doctrines. They didn't need all of that to be rehashed. They didn't need to go back to, first grade Sunday school. They had it. What they needed was, okay, how do I live? How can I be discipled? Ooh, scary word. We don't do that very well. We forgot that somewhere in the 50s, I think, and never picked it back up. You don't even see James dealing with a question, except maybe what is the place of works in salvation. But I mean, with Paul, at least when you read something like 1 Thessalonians, the question on their mind is, did we miss the second coming? Has he already been here? Do we miss it? You don't get that with James. It's not there. So, what does he talk about? Hello. Why are you doing this to me? It's a real shame when you get on a roll and then technology decides it hates you. Okay, well, fine. Y'all will just have to listen. I've got a list of 7 for you, so just hold on. First one seems obvious. He talks about God. He talks a lot about God. He talks about how Christians are supposed to live and act in full consciousness of the character of the God they serve. You know who God is, act like it. That's the bumper sticker. He talks a lot about eschatology, end time stuff. For James, the deal is the end is on the back door. Like Jesus is raising his fist to knock. It's about to be over. How are you supposed to live? Faith, works, and justification. We're going to save it. The law. We're also going to save it. The Christian life. This is where James makes his most important contribution, and if there is a theme, that's what it is. But also wisdom. Imagine this, it's connected to your works. How do you decide what to do? How do you decide what is the right thing to do? How do you decide how to behave and react and enact and all the rest of it? And then number 7, poverty and wealth. Now, on the poverty and wealth thing, we need to be a little bit familiar with the Jewish cultural relationship between poverty and wealth, because it is not what we have now. Well, I say that. It is what some of us have now. Let's say it that way. Which is, I've got 4 parts to this. Part 1, God has a particular concern for the poor. He has a concern for the downtrodden. He has a concern for the outcasts. Go just pick pretty much any book you want to and throw your finger down, and you're going to see that God has that kind of care, all right? Part 2, if also have concern for helpless people. Okay, part 3 is helpless people, because of God's care for them, are also usually identified as the most pious and the most righteous group of people. And if the poor are the most pious and the most righteous, then part 4 is the wealthy are evil. That is the relationship that the Jews have with poverty and wealth. So when James, and when we get to that we'll see it, but when James is writing about poverty and wealth, we need to keep in mind that that is the Jewish way of thinking, okay? And I say that we don't have that now because in some ways we idolize rich people. And, you know, I'll go ahead and throw this one out there because y'all know I like to get myself in trouble. But there is a reason why the poorest parts of our country put one of the richest men in the country in the White House. Right? We have a weird relationship with money in our country. So we don't necessarily come down in the exact same place that the Jews did, but we get close, right? We wanted, in some ways, we wanted Trump to get the other rich people, right? We wanted him to stick it to them, because he can. He's one of us, he gets us, but he's not poor. He has means, and therefore he can do something. James is going to talk about some of that. He's going to talk about some of that mentality that gets us there. So that's kind of what you have to look forward to. I gave you the outline there, which we did not have time to go over, but you'll kind of see the way that I intend to halfway break this down. It'll never work out this cleanly, but you know, we'll do what we can. Notice that it's 5 chapters. I've given it basically 6 different headings because it's just kind of that pieced together. So we got some work to do, but we'll do it. All right, questions, comments, irritations, frustrations, rebukes, rebuttals? All right, very good.